I watched this video. I taped it in May, and I didn't the documentary, and I somehow didn't get to it until about September. And I watched it, and I just loved it. I just was totally blown away. And then I saw there was a book about it, and then I thought, oh, the author series. We can have Bill come. So I am really happy to have journalist and documentary producer Bill Lichtenstein here to speak about WBCN and the American Revolution. Bill has written for publications including the New York Times, The Nation, The Village Voice, and the Boston Globe, and I'm sure many others, and is a winner of more than 60 major journalism awards. He produced and directed the feature-length documentary WBCN and the American Revolution, which is airing this week on PBS, and if you have not seen it, tape it. It's Friday at 9, and I think it's also some other times on demand this week. So definitely catch that if you haven't already. Bill worked at WBCN from 1971 to 1977, beginning at the age of 14 as a volunteer on the listener line. So on the station's listener line, which I really want to hear about. And amazing that at 14 you did that. And now you're here having done this documentary. At WBCN, creativity and countercultural politics ruled. There were no set playlists, news segments anticipated the satire of The Daily Show. On-air interviewees ranged from John and Yoko to Noam Chomsky. The story is told in the movie and the book from 1968 to Watergate, when Boston's WBCN was the hub of the rock and roll, anti-war, psychedelic world. And we are going to play the trailer from the documentary, and then I will chat with Bill, and I will be sure to leave time for your questions. Please put your questions in the chat, and we will answer as many as we can. So.
And now it's time for our revolutionary new experiment in radio.
This is WBCN in Boston.
I'm gonna tell you a story.
There wasn't any radio station at all that played any of this kind of music.
I'm gonna tell you a story, baby.
It was clearly ours. Older people didn't like it, didn't understand it.
Well, we were all hippies. We all had long hair.
With 240,000 students in Boston, the best chance I had to pay the rent on this thing was to play rock music.
For the first time, there was an outlet for music like this on the radio.
You'd hear some Muddy, you'd hear some Grateful Dead.
Jefferson Airplane, Steve Miller Band, Quicksilver Messenger Service, and Donovan.
Jimi Hendrix.
Hello, Bruce Springsteen.
We're on the air?
Yeah, we're on the air.
Hey! This is my very first time on radio, and I want to say hello to my mother who lives in California. Hi, Mom.
You were not going to hear this music anywhere except at WBCN.
He did not hire professional radio announcers. He hired kids.
I was a philosophy major with no career prospects.
Boston was in the grips of counterculture, students trying to find new ways of living, new ways of being.
This was the group of Mama Tupa Hoppa Dupa. You're listening to WBCN FM 104.1 in Boston.
The response from people was so great because we were sort of treating radio not as a performance, but as a relationship with our listeners.
In the news right now, police in Boston got orders this morning to halt an anti-war demonstration. About 30 Vietnam veterans.
The Vietnam War hung over everything.
Boston was a battleground of ideas. Henry Kissinger taught at Harvard.
250,000 college students, most of whom by then had turned against the war.
Nixon was the personification of American evil.
The FBI came to the house one morning.
They came in, all of them had their guns drawn.
It was an autumn of chaos, huge marches.
The pigs are coming! The pigs are coming! The pigs are coming! We gotta have a revolution!
We formed a radio consciousness that was further and further and further more political and more dangerous.
Women, disc jockeys, not just in the news department. It was like transformative.
Giving a voice for the first time to out-open gay people on the radio.
I don't know which disc jockey it was, but when they said, this is the American Revolution, you know, and you felt that they meant it.
People trying to put us down.
We were trying to create something that hadn't existed before.
It was the internet of its day.
Independence, having people make up their own minds as to what to play, what to say.
Stuff like that on the radio, wow, amazing.
We had the real thing.
WBCN in Boston.
Scoopy-doopy-doopy-doop. Bow-bow-bow-yabba-ooh-ooh, chicka-boom.
So much energy in this movie. It's incredible. I wanted first, like, how did you, I just want to know, I think a lot of people want to know, how did you start doing this? When did you start doing this? You know,
well,
documentary and book.
I've joked that, you know, it really started 50 years ago because being at WBCN, being in the thick of all of this stuff going on, you know, as many people did during that period, I began to sort of keep things, a little piece of tape or a photograph, Life magazine cover. And so really collecting stuff, not knowing what it would be for, but just sort of having a sense that there was great historical value in a button from a demonstration sort of started then. The genesis of this film actually was in the early 2000s. We were negotiating with the family of Phil Oakes to try to do a documentary about his life, with the intention being an object lesson in how artists, musicians, you know, activists can use their talents to create social change. And it seemed like in the wake of 9/11 and during the Iraq War that people had forgotten about that. Bruce Springsteen did a benefit at that point for John Kerry, who was a Democratic candidate for president and was accused of being too political. I think back in the day, it would have been a sellout if you were supporting, you know, the Democratic Party candidate. But anyway, there was a split in the family. They ended up going with his brother's choice for filmmaker. Kim Bowser did a great piece, a film for American Masters. We were working with his sister, Sonny. And I began to think about other ways of trying to do that film. And around that time, 2006, was the time of Napster, and the internet was really exploding. And I began to find little things on the internet that had been lost to the ages. The Bruce Springsteen interview, which had disappeared somehow, a photograph of Danny Schechter, Dan Ellsberg.
Where did you get that, Bruce Springsteen?
Well, that's an interesting story. So I heard Springsteen live on the air, and just it completely changed my life. And Maxanne Satori had interviewed him, and I asked her if there was a tape, and she said it was in her box where she kept stuff. And so I got it, and it turned out the tape was a half-hour long. So right at the end, at the beginning, was really the best song on the whole tape, Blinded by the Light. The tape stopped about 3 minutes, 30 seconds into the song. So the song wasn't there, it just ended abruptly. I thought, gee, that's too bad. And then something that never happened, the tape disappeared. Somebody stole it or took it home, or it just never happened. And that was gone for 30, 40 years. I thought of that amazing tape. And suddenly in 2006, it appeared on the internet. Bruce Springsteen on BCN. I thought, oh my goodness. So I got a copy of it from the person that had it. And sure enough, at the 30-minute mark, it ended just abruptly as the original. So I knew that was a descendant of the original tape from BCN. And it just appeared on the internet, and began to realize there was other stuff out there. Because BCN, there were no archives of the station. That was the biggest obstacle to making this film. So all of this stuff was crowdsourced from people that were listeners who had things in their own collections.
So it's interesting how people always were taping a radios, people were always taping the radio, I think, in those days. Isn't that like a common?
Well, because you couldn't get music any other way unless you go to the record store and buy it. But if there was a new album or an album that was obscure or foreign import, you wouldn't know where to get it. And so
it's amazing. It's amazing that they kept it.
The people kept it.
Yeah, I don't know why it's. Maybe someone's not muted. That's why I echoed.
1, 2. I think there we go. It's not just amazing that people kept it, but the way they treated the material. As we were collecting stuff towards the end, I got a call from somebody, didn't know this person, but he said, my brother was a big fan of WBCN. He passed away recently. We're cleaning out his attic, and I found these tapes. There were tape broadcasts of BCN, and I heard about your film and thought you might like them.
Yeah.
His family's going through the worst, horrible situation. In the midst of it, They're thinking, oh, BCN, let's help BCN.
So you said there's an archive at UMass Amherst?
We began to find so much stuff that it seemed like there had to be some way of both helping us manage it, especially photographs, where we would get negatives from photographers, and also to set up a permanent archive. So at UMass Amherst, all of the material that we found, all the photographs taken by Peter Simon, Jeff Albertson, these great photographers from that era, plus they just got all of the papers from Dan Ellsberg, his personal papers are there. People like Jim Queskin and Normal, the marijuana group. So it is a collection of material from the 60s, 70s about social change in this part of the country. It's really like the preeminent collection right now.
It's incredible because I missed it. I was a little bit too young, just a little bit too young, because I listened to the station later in the 70s. But in the early, I was amazed at what I had, of course, missed as being too young, but you were just at the cusp, being 14 to start there. I
was among all the kids who had older brothers and sisters who were in college listening to it, and we kind of were like looking over their shoulders.
What was it like to be there? Like, what was it like as a teenager to actually be there?
It was the most unusual place. And one of the things that I realized doing the film is that there was nobody there who got their job by answering a job ad or sending in a resume, or everybody wandered in there somehow and said, hi, I'd like to help. Can I volunteer? Or they met somebody, can you come sit in on your show? And everybody sort of found a way in there just because they really had to be involved. And so it was a collection of people who really just cared about the station. And it was really because they were so open, to this idea that the airways were for the people. You never knew who was going to come wandering in, and suddenly, is there Bernadette Devlin, who was, the Irish parliamentary, radical from IRA, and, was in town. She came by, and all of a sudden she's in the station wandering around. Abby Hoffman used to drop by a lot.
In the movie.
Yeah, from Worcester. You just never knew. That's what was sort of the magic of the place.
There was one where I was talking to my uncle who was at Harvard during those years as a grad student, and he said to me, I listened to all that music, but I didn't have a FM radio. And that was that like to have an FM radio? It sounded obviously a lot of people did, but was that like changing at that point that the radio?
Well, there was no FM initially in BCN.
Started AM.
Well, no, there was no. BCN started because of the classical music station. It was an FM station that they came on the late night hours. FM originally came along with mainly classical music because there was no static and it was stereo, and you could get this really great sound. And then, as it wasn't really taking off commercially, they began to play rock and roll on some of the stations, and that's what sort of started it.
When was that? That was around then, 68 or 60?
Right around the same time.
Okay.
What Ray did, there were two other stations, KCN in San Francisco, which was the first to play rock on FM, and then in New York there was a station, WNEW. But BCN was the first. The fact that they hired kids, they were all college students, and Ray Reapin had this vision, not just of a station that was going to play rock and roll, but there would be a whole different kind of radio. And I think Tommy Hadges, one of the announcers in the trailer, really says it. They changed radio from being a performance to being a relationship with its listeners, which if you listen to, Fresh Air or NPR these days, it's not so unusual to have that kind of chatty. It didn't exist. There's a tape, it's in the book transcribed of the Who the day Tommy came out, coming by, and Peter Townsend goes into this lengthy explanation of the meaning of Tommy and why he wrote it. And, and so now you hear that kind of thing on the radio all the time. Just never happened.
So the music was more, no one had talked to the musicians, you're saying? Like
no, you turned on and the music was there, and maybe some.
Now we know everything. Right.
They got them on the phone and did a quick, but it wasn't that kind of discussion. And certainly they didn't come along with their guitar or Bruce Springsteen did with his tuba.
That Bruce Springsteen thing, everyone has to watch that, if nothing else, although you should watch the whole movie. So the book came out yesterday. It is very heavy and it's incredible. I watched the documentary twice, in September and then this week. And I would have thought, oh, I don't need a book about this. And then the book came and I loved it. It was all the things that are passing by, even watching it again, extra things. Like there's an interview with John and Yoko about feminism that is not in the movie.
Right? Yeah.
It's incredible. Like that's incredible. There's so much in here. What are the things that are in here, what you would say that are not in the documentary that?
The music things that are substantial, the interview with The Who, the John Lennon interview, which was Danny Schechter interviewing them because Yoko was in town for the first International Women's Conference in '73, and Danny interviewed them. And John Lennon was talking about how he was starting to cook and that he was staying home and doing more cooking, which was just, one of the things about this film to me was for people who were younger to understand how much things changed in a lot of cases in a positive way. The idea that it was unheard of for women to be on the radio. I don't know how many young women know that, and it was really, is oftentimes young women will roll their eyes when they hear the word feminist or feminism. It took the changes and the commitment and the struggle of the women of that era to change these things. So even in '73, the fact that John Lennon was staying home and cooking it made headlines around the world that John Lennon's a feminist. And he says, he thought about it. He thought, why shouldn't he? He said, if Yoko and I broke up, I should know how to cook and she should know how to fix a bicycle.
Right.
And this was like, unheard of to have that kind of from a celebrity like that.
Wow. And in the documentary and in the book, like the women speak about how it was for them. Like they were basically, there was no role for them at all.
No, what I was surprised to learn, because it's almost unbelievable, is that the standard response to the idea of women being on the radio was that their voices are too annoying.
Right.
Is essentially what it was, that nobody wants to hear those voices. And there's a clip of in the film of a local conservative talk show host on the air saying that women don't belong on the radio. And he especially singles out women who are trying to be taken seriously. He says they're trying to be like men, like, hi, I'm here with the news.
Right.
And he's saying, if they want to be like Dinah Shore or Chatty, or that's okay, because that's like being a woman. But these ones who want to be like men, and it's amazing how bad it was. And I think that period just had a tremendous impact in that area, gay and lesbian rights. A lot of issues really changed dramatically in a very short period of time.
And then the Lavender Hour, can you talk about that too a little bit?
John Scagliotti and Andy Kopkine were hired to work in the news department. They were a couple. Andy was a quite well-known journalist, was fired from Time magazine, where he was being groomed to be the editor of Time, when he was arrested, John says in the movie, arrested for being gay. And it was pretty much right. They had a raid on a park and he was there, and he was arrested for being gay and had to leave Time magazine. And he started writing for left-wing journals. And John and Andy came to BCN and created a show in 1973 called The Lavender Hour. But it wasn't kind of a heavy, the show was really like an entertaining show that would be of interest to people who are gay about music and culture and fashion. And at one point, John gets in an argument with David Bowie about why Bowie say he's bisexual when he's really gay. And
on the air.
Yeah. It's fascinating. One legacy, and it's the kind of thing when we talk about, the impact the station had more globally, is in '73 or '4, they decided to form a union, just, to have a union in place. And when they sat down with management to negotiate a contract, one of the terms that they asked for was unheard of in any union contract. And it was that you could not be fired. You couldn't be fired for your race or religion or creed, but it was also you could not be fired for your sexual orientation. And the story goes that one of the managers said, "What does that mean?" And Andy Kopkind said, "Well, it means you can't fire me because I'm gay." And I said, "Oh, that's a good idea." So they put it in that contract. It was a contract of the United Electrical Workers, and that became a model clause for union contracts going forward. It was really the first time that there was that kind of protection given to people for sexual preference.
There's so much in this movie for that type of thing. Like, you know, that you if someone thinks, oh, it's about the radio stage, there's so much in this. I just want to look at the question. So some of the chat things. So someone said they worked on the listener line as a college student in the late 70s. And remember that about half of the song requests back then were either for Freebird or Stairway to Heaven. That sounds about right.
And Heroin by the Velvet Underground.
And that was late 70s, she said. So that's when I was listening. Let's see. And someone asked about WNTN in Newton, which I actually remember going there. I lived in Newton then.
I actually worked there for summer during the day. Howard Stern started off there since he was fired from. It was in a little tiny, that little house in Newton. It was great, but they were only on when the sun was out. We had to go off the air.
Let's see what else. I don't know if people have questions. Let's see. And someone asked about the movie. It'll be out on DVD, and it's also streaming right now. Let's see. I don't know if there's I'm not sure we actually have questions. People are telling their stories. Let's see. So actually, like how much, I'm not sure. Do you see the question by Cheryl Holland? I'm not sure. Because I didn't know if WBCN. I grew up in New York, so I listened to WBAI. However, I was part of a pirate radio network, the Falling Star Network, and I had a Friday night show for years. The Federal Candy, they busted by the FCC, which we called the Federal Candy Company. So it sounds like a lot of people maybe.
BAI, BCN was sort of a hybrid. It was very radical and political, and in a lot of ways like BAI, and you can expect to hear some of the same people on the air. But it was also a rock and roll station and a commercial station, at 50,000 watts. It got out to 6 states in New England. Wow. It was on top of the Prudential building. And so, it wasn't like a station that was in a church basement someplace. It was there. And Danny Schechter, the news dissector who passed away a few years ago, and I think it's in the book, he said, one of the things that made the station so powerful is it was a voice for people, and people could see it. There it is on top of the Prudential building. And people knew that it was sort of their voice in Boston.
So will you talk about Danny Schechter? Because there's a lot about him, and he's interviewed a lot, and it seems like he's a really important part of the station.
He had a tremendous impact, not just on the news coverage of BCN, but on news generally. When he passed away, I wrote a eulogy for the Boston Globe and spoke with a number of people whose profession it is to be, news watchers, news analysts, Jonathan Alter, Newsweek. And every one of them said he was the first. Jonathan Alter said, it's in the Globe article, all the years I was at Newsweek, I was doing my Danny Schechter imitation. What that means is Danny was the first person to look at the language, to look at who owned the media companies and what their political bents were, who were they interviewing, what are the questions being asked. So, for example, during the Vietnam War, throughout, no matter where you got your news, they always talked about how many enemy were killed. 25 enemy were killed last week, or U.S. planes bombed an enemy stronghold. And this was an undeclared war. They weren't our enemy. And Danny, I think with the, I don't want to say guidance, but, through discussions with Noam Chomsky, who was also a linguist and sort of brought that to the table, was very conscious of language. So we would never say enemy, in the newscast, even though it would come through that way on the Associated Press. And I also, the kinds of stories he covered, but as a journalist, that it was an activist journalist. I mean, he was a really, really good journalist and went on to work at ABC later and, really had a big impact. The other thing that we did, and I was a part of this, was to integrate news with comedy and music and make news entertaining.
Yeah.
And rather than, as you would think, make it less relevant and less credible, it had the opposite effect. And in a way, you can draw a straight line from that to the Daily Show, where people marvel at the fact, that a few years ago it was said the most credible newsman in America is Jon Stewart, who's a comedian. How could that be? But it's when you take stuff and take away that layer of objectivity, and that's the way it is, and put it in context, it becomes more credible. It becomes more understandable.
That's what's so amazing about what you did, because yes, like I didn't realize where it came, like when it would have started. Maybe it started before in other ways, like Tom Lehrer or someone like that. But this was the news. This was actually the news.
Night after night, the news.
Twice a day, which is really that was really novel that they were doing that.
He brought, Allen Ginsberg was on another piece of tape we tried to find a way to use. Allen Ginsberg came on and read the news. He had a little, I don't know what you call it. It was an instrument that used to play. You pumped it, the air would go through it, and but he was singing the news stories, and then he made up a poem about the environment. There was a story about the effects of pollution, and so he integrated all of this poetry live on the air with these stories. And again, it just makes it more relevant, more interesting. It's people watch or get the news from the Daily Show or Colbert.
Right, we're used to that now.
Yeah.
So here are a few questions. Okay, is there anything that you discovered during the course of your research that was particularly surprising to you?
That's a really good question. Well, one thing that was not known to anybody was Bo Burlingham, who was the first real full-time news director there, had to leave after 2 or 3 days when he was indicted for being part of the Weathermen, and 13 members of the Weathermen were indicted for an alleged plot to blow up buildings. It turns out it never occurred, but and at the time he told everybody that he was absolutely not a member of the Weathermen, that he was a journalist covering them and got caught up in this mess. And it turns out he was, and he told the story that's much more compelling and human. I think he had decided to get out once they had started to talk about blowing things up, and he got caught up with that. But let me think about if there's anything. I know there were things along the way that which is.
Even were you surprised by even all the photographs and the clips that it's so incredible what you have.
Oh, I know what was surprising.
Yeah.
This is really interesting. This is interesting. So, it's a truism about the Harvard strike. In 1969, students took over University Hall, Dean's office, to protest the war. And police were called in the next morning. And it's always been theorized that, it was sort of a class issue. The police were sort of resentful of these kids who had everything. And here they are, taking this kind of semi-violent act. And the police really beat up on the students. And it set off the Harvard strike. 14,000 people at Harvard voted to go out on strike. And it's been said, and I've heard it, over and over again for the last 40 years, that it was so foolish of President Pusey to have called the police in. Why would he have done that, knowing that at Columbia University, not long before, they brought the police on campus and it had been the same thing? And there's never really been a good explanation as to, why that happened. Well, it turns out that he said at the time, and it was never really reported, we haven't, that he did it because it was Danny Schechter and Michael and Sarah from SDS were going through the confidential files in the dean's office, and they wanted them out, and that was the reason that the police were called onto campus.
But they took everything anyway.
And then there was an article in the Harvard Alumni Magazine, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, and I've tried to find out if it's ever been revised, but I think this was still the situation that nobody knew how those documents got from the dean's office into print in this underground newspaper, and the film explains it. Danny snuck them out in a book bag, and
that's a great story in the document.
Sort of feign being upset about the protest to get through the police lines. And
so that comes to the next question, which is relevant. Was there any relationship between BCN and WHRB, the Harvard radio station? What were they doing, or do you know?
Well, yeah, no, HRB was a great station. In fact, one of the reporters there at the time was Chris Wallace, who covered
Oh,
now Fox, Mike Wallace's son,
Yep.
Who covered the Harvard strike. There are tapes of him being arrested. Amazing. But HRB, there were a number of student stations in Boston that were sort of feeders into BCN. They were doing, the student stations in those days tended to be more block programming. So it'd be 2 hours of folk,
Right.
and another student would come in with their classical albums, and that was, and the signals weren't very strong. So some of them would only be heard on
I see. So they
campus.
couldn't really compete or.
Yeah,
relevant.
but people sort of knew in the times people would trade tape if something happened. They had a tape of something. Yeah.
So someone mentioned that there wasn't much on Charles Laquadera, also known as Gordon Glasscock, but I feel like he was interviewed. You kind of kept him in with everyone else, because wasn't there a documentary about him a few years ago? I feel like there was one just about.
Yeah, he was interviewed. He took off. What's interesting is, you saw that scene. There was a.
Oh, Dwayne Glasscock. Yeah.
Dwayne Glasscock was his alter ego. There was a scene that ended up not in the film. It's in the book, where Steven Seagal played these bootleg Beatles tapes that were made at those sessions that we now know were going on in Apple Studios recording Let It Be. And Charles says of Steven, and others say of Steven, he was the one that really infused the spirit of BCN, the speak, truth to power and all this stuff, the irreverence. In a way, Steven was probably the most influential person in the early days and through this period. Charles was there. It was about 72 or 73, towards the end of the period that the film covers, that Charles, who was on late nights, started doing his morning show.
So was that in the 70s that he started?
Yeah.
Doing it? Okay.
And that took off, and that was really, it was the antecedent of all of these. Every station in America now has a morning zoo with voices and calls and contests and shtick, and Howard Stern was a student at BU listening to this and says he got the idea for his morning show in a lot of ways from Charles. And Charles became, probably the biggest media celebrity in Boston during those years. This slightly precedes it, and I would argue he's not in the film. I think
he is. I agree.
He's sort of on equal level with everybody
else.
He
is equal, because that's what I remember is him, like WBCN and Charles Laquadera and the Big Mattress. But that's such a different scene than this is.
Well, he was on 10 to 2, and that was really like 1, 2 in the morning. He would be stoned, and he'd be doing some rant about, the police or, just sort of speculating about something. And that was really sort of vintage, old school progressive radio. And because, of course, in those days, the hours everybody was listening to, it was like 10 to 2 in the morning. It was until later, the mornings were just kind of a graveyard shift. Nobody got up at 7, 8 o'clock in the morning. The story of how he ended up in the mornings is funny. Dinah Vaprin, the woman who was on the mornings, they had a announcers meeting in 72, and they went through a new schedule. And Norm Weiner, who was the program director, said, Dinah, you're going to continue to do the mornings. And she said, oh, sure, give the mornings to a woman. Don't let a woman in. And Charles said to her, Dinah, it's an honor to be on any time on this station. I'll do the mornings.
Wow, and then it made his career.
And then as he was walking out, he said to him, what did I just do? Yeah, because for years he was on, and he had to get up, like 4 o'clock in the morning. Crazy.
Wow. So just to get to the end, I was just wondering, how did the station end? I know that's not what you are talking about, but how did it end? Because we remember the 70s and the 80s. And
it had lost a lot of its, a considerable amount of its home by 2009. It was still on 104. CBS decided they wanted to have a competitive sports station on FM. There was already one. They wanted one of their stations. And so in order to free up a space, they had to move things around. And instead of leaving BCN on the air, they took another station that was on a different frequency and moved it to 104. And and so BCN just went off the air. It was like unimaginable, but it just one day was just gone. And they had 4 or 5 days of just, no commercials, just playing all these tapes. And then at the end, Bradley J., who did just, a brilliant job. They created this sort of montage of stuff from the station, and then, played it. And then at the appointed hour at midnight, they hit the button.
Wow.
Took it off the air.
Wow. If you have questions, they should put some more questions in, and I want you to look at this afterwards, because a lot of people are writing to you all sorts of things, but we can talk about that later.
This was lost out to commercialism. I think, BCN's commitment to being non-commercial started to, filter in around the time my film ends, and they were starting to take more national ads. They were starting to do more commercials per hour, and then by the 80s, it really was, sort of like any. I mean, I've said it a number of times. It was like any other incredibly successful, huge rock station, commercially successful rock station, but it didn't have the kind of impact and iconoclastic impact that the original.
So I think you said in the documentary that in the AM, or there were 22 minutes of commercials an hour or half hour.
Yeah, yeah, and BCN kept it to 8.
So how did they do financially with that? It must have been okay because they kept going.
For starters, they were paying college kids who were making $3-4 an hour to be on the air.
And they had 14-year-olds working.
14-year-olds, volunteers on the listener line. And the ad rates went through the roof. Everybody wanted to advertise on that station because there was 300,000-400,000 college kids in Boston. And so today, if you're a rock promoter or you're selling a book that young people would like or whatever, your clothing, you've got 1 million, create your own website. In those days, the only way you could reach that audience of college kids predictably was on BCN. And so everybody wanted to be on BCN, and the ad rates, went through the roof.
Well, someone wrote that they were a sound engineer for concerts on the Common in '72. The night that Rod Stewart played, following the concert, I was hanging out along with a friend of mine with Rod in his hotel room at the Statler Hilton, now the Park Plaza. He had the radio on to BCN and would repeatedly call into the station requesting Spanish Harlem by Aretha Franklin, which was a current hit. Maxine was on the air. Maxine, is that where Maxine?
Yeah.
Was on the air and interviewed Rod this afternoon. And since she recognized his voice, she played the song every time he called, 4 times in all. Freeform radio, indeed. I'm sure a lot of people have their memories of listening.
I've heard that story. Yeah, no, there was, somebody said that when he first heard his song on the radio was like, sort of, he hadn't heard because this music was not getting played on AM radio. You didn't hear Rod Stewart singing Spanish Harlem on WMEX or WRKO. So that was very different. Here's one. Bill, could you comment on Concert Network? So the Concert Network, T. Mitchell Hastings was an MIT grad who invented a number of circuits that were used in FM radio and made a lot of money. And his dream was to have a string of classical music stations up and down the East Coast called the Concert Network. So by the early 60s, he had WNCN, which is still around in New York, classical station, WHCN in Hartford, I think XCN was Providence, and WBCN, Boston Concert Network, was in Boston. But they just weren't making money after a certain point. People weren't flocking to FM the way people had hoped. And especially in the middle of the night, nobody was listening to BCN. And that's when, Ray Reapin found the station and offered them money, essentially bought out the hours between 6 at night and 6 in the morning. And they started making money so fast that they quickly, went 24 hours. The group of people that owned the stations, including Hastings, were, sort of dyed-in-the-wool Republicans and didn't really understand it all, but, it was making them money and they were happy with that.
And what was it like to be on the listener line? Stephanie asks.
The listener line was, honestly, the effort was to tell people, if you have a question, no matter what it is, call us. It was sort of the Google of its time. And they had several services. One of them was, and it's almost impossible to believe that the lawyers let this go. There weren't any lawyers, I guess is the reason, or that somebody wasn't horribly injured by this, but which I don't think they were. But it was a ride service. And so you would call and say, I'm driving to Michigan tomorrow, and I need somebody to drive with me and share the driving and the cost of gas. And then somebody else would call and say, hi, I'm trying to get to Michigan. And you'd say, well, this guy is driving to Michigan. And then they do it on the air and they read the phone numbers like I'm on the air. So, you can imagine, this woman's driving to California tomorrow if you'd like to go with her, just it couldn't happen today. It happened. And as far as everybody knows, there were never any ill effects from it. There was a lost dog and cat service, or people having puppies, called the Cat and Dog Report, which actually, people found their animals through, BCN, and a thing called Musicians Connection, where drummer looking for band looking for drummer. But in addition to that, we were schooled in answering any question, and this was before computers, so there was a big shelf of books. And Charles Laquadera, who ran it, it was his vision, used to say to us, look, the bottom line is, even if you have no clue, you have to give them some place to go where they might be able to find it. You can't just say, I can't help you. You have to say, try, But there were also frequently people calling up with really serious life problems. They just got a draft notice. They didn't know what to do, or my roommate took too much LSD. And this became sort of an ongoing part of the line, is people who would be on the phone with somebody on a bad acid trip, sometimes for hours.
So would the people sometimes, would they sometimes get on air, or was it, you sounded like
not somebody was on a bad acid trip.
No, but so they would just be talking to the listener line people.
Right, but if somebody called up and said, hey, there's this band playing on the Cambridge Common right now, and they're great, I don't know how, or there's a demonstration being called for 4:00 to protest what happened at BU yesterday, they would sometimes put them right on the air, and people knew that you could. It was that kind of access to the air where people knew if you came up there with a tape of a band that was really great, or if you called and said, you were just a button push away from being on the air. And this is without any, time delay. You were live on the air through the course of the station, right to the end. They trusted people not to get them in trouble.
Must have been so exciting. So do you think this is why you're doing what you're doing, or you obviously went there because it was something in you that was interested also? But
well, I love radio. So it really was tremendously, it was a great experience. But I think at the heart of it was the idea that media can create social change in any area. And how does media create social change? And that's become, I think, sort of a lifelong interest of mine. Here's a problem, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not going to sue, I'm not going to, get elected and file legislation. What can journalism do? What can media do to change this? And I think in a lot of ways, it's usually the biggest bang for the buck is what you can get from media and journalism addressing a problem. But it was an incredible group of people. And one of the sleights of hand of the film that may not be immediately evident, but it's there in the DNA of it, is the people who were successful in that station were incredibly great storytellers. Their timing, their sensibilities, the way they told the story. And so to be able to interview all of them and tell these great stories, it gave us a set of interviews that were just great.
Are there any places people could listen to WBCN, like an hour of it, not just little pieces? Is it somewhere?
Yeah, what I've done is, and we're going to sort of keep upgrading it and try to figure out a way to manage it. If you go to AMREV, I should type it in here, AMREV.
And some of the interviews too.
Airtime.pro. What we've done is we've taken hundreds of hours. It should be on the chat box right now.
Yep, it
We've
is.
taken hundreds of hours of tapes and just put them up randomly. So you might hear a commercial, a news story,
Wow.
you might hear a bunch of album cuts, but it's about the closest thing there is to listening to the station in part, because you don't know what's going to happen.
And are those just extra, like some of the extra tapes that you got? Is that someone else doing that, or is that part of this project?
That was part of this project. Tony Wormuth, who was a volunteer, took that on working with me and spent, years going through and finding songs that, the song should be there. It's important song from that era.
I think a lot of us are going to go on there after this and listen to that.
It actually has a building audience around the world, which is interesting. In China and England, in any time of the day or night, there are people listening to it. So.
Okay. Yeah, the documentary is available. Someone asked about. We can just say that again. You can tell.
The documentary is available, most easily available if you go to pbs.org, the main PBS website, and just search for WBCN. It's streaming there through the 6th. And I don't know if it's midnight the 6th, like I assume it will be up on the 6th, but at least through the 5th and probably the 6th. It's then continuing to play in some cities. It will be on in New York this Friday night at 9 o'clock on WNET, the main PBS station. And then on the 30th and 31st, it will be on in Los Angeles on KCET. And you can check local listings and maybe on other places. But the easiest way to see it is on the PBS channel. Or if you go to your own local station, most of them are streaming it as well. After that, there are DVDs available if you go to Amazon DVDs, and you can also, look at it online. After this, they'll be available.
Did you work on the book at the same time as when did you decide you were going to do a book also?
While I was working on the film, I decided to do the book. Right before we started to edit, I stopped and spent 2-3 months writing a full treatment for the book. So these are the chapters. This is what's going to be in each chapter. It's very substantial, but it gave me the narrative arc for the book. And that also became the narrative arc for the film. Where did it started? Where does the women's protest at the station go in relationship to the news department that's being formed?
Yeah.
And that sort of one overlaid the other. And then I stopped, finished the film, and then went back and did the write through of the book and wrote all of it. And then the clearances weren't so bad because most of the visual stuff were from photographers who were really generous with their work and gave it to us for, a small amount of money or in many cases free. A lot of the music was fair use, but clearing some of the songs took a lot of time. And some of them were fairly expensive. The most interesting story, I think, is, it was clear that, in fact, I had a meeting with somebody at GBH who was interested in just helping the project early on because they weren't formally involved. And he said, just promise me one thing. I said, what's that? He goes, right, if you use Revolution, get the Beatles version. He says, I couldn't watch this film if you have other versions, it's like, get the real thing if you're going to do it, which, I agreed with. And so we had to clear the Beatles material. The Beatles material in the film that we use is Revolution, which I think is the second or third most difficult song to get use of in any commercial use, is right in the open. And then there's a section where we talk about Sgt. Pepper and the impact that it had. By the terms of what's called fair use, we have a right to use that material. If you make reference to something, Frank Sinatra has passed away on the evening news, you want to show enough of a clip so people can see him, or you want to say Sgt. Pepper was a very influential album, and you want to play just 7 seconds, that's fair use. You should be able to do that. My concern was, when you're dealing with the Beatles, they've got the toughest lawyers in the business, and you don't want to get into a pushing match with them over it. So we contacted them just to say, hi, we want to use this material. It will help open the group up to a new generation of kids that maybe haven't heard of the Beatles. And somebody said, "Oh, you should write to Jeff Jones. He's the new CEO. He's from Arlington, Massachusetts."
Oh my God.
So I wrote to Jeff Jones and said, "We're doing BCN." And he's the CEO of Apple, right? And he's like, "Oh, I love BCN."
Oh.
So he gave the marching orders, like, work this out with these
I want
guys.
to do this.
And so it wasn't cheap, but it wasn't, what it could have been. And so we were really thrilled. And in fact, he gets a special thank you at the end.
So one thing that's interesting to me, it feels like a Boston, story, but it's obviously going all across the country. So have you heard from people? I mean, obviously there can be people, someone wrote in that they were, used to live in Boston and now they live somewhere else. But it'll be interesting, I think, to see what people who never heard it would think. Have you heard from those people?
Yeah, and the whole thing was constructed. Well, from the beginning, all we heard throughout trying to raise money, trying to whatever is, well, that's a Boston story. Nobody's going to be interested outside of Boston. So the mission was to find the things where BCN made a difference on a national level, that somebody in California, Montana, whatever, would find it interesting.
Right.
And so that was really the filter, that we worked with, and took out stuff where people in Boston might be interested. I mean, that said, there's obviously far more interest and passion, I think, from people who grew up with it and remember the station. To the point where it still amazes me, the depths of people's love for that station. I've said, I think the guy interviewed me for the Globe, I told him, if you go back 50 years and think of any cultural phenomenon, institution happening from 50 years ago, that people still, when you mention it, go, "Oh my goodness."
Right.
The only other one I can think of is the Brooklyn Dodgers,
Yeah.
that are gone.
Yeah.
And people just react to it. When you go BCN, people just go, "Oh, BCN." I still haven't fully figured out what that's about. It's just, I think it was a part of our lives at such an important point. We came in contact with music and fashion and politics, and life and death, and through that station, that it sort of became intertwined with all of it and became just an important part of our lives.
I realized I missed the best part of it, though, because the late 70s was a totally different thing than this part of it for the people working there, for the people listening.
I can't tell you, though, how I would say there was nobody that before I started was aware of all this stuff. If you look at the film
interesting. Okay.
and think, "Oh, well, if I had been around, I would have known all this."
I see.
Charles Laquadera said to me that he had forgotten that he interviewed The Who. He said, "People always say to me, 'Didn't you interview The Who?' And he said, 'No,' until I found, the tape of it." Most people maybe knew a couple of those things, but the scope of it, I think, is fresh.
You did something amazing for BCN, for the city, for people that love
The other thing I don't understand fully is why, if you look at comparable situations in San Francisco, like with Haight-Ashbury, or the East Village in New York, so much has been written and so much has been documented in movies and interviews, and everybody knows the players, Grateful Dead and Bill Graham. In Boston, none of this was really talked about. Ray Reapan, who created the Boston Tea Party, WBCN, and the Phoenix newspaper, arguably, if you do the It's a Wonderful Life approach and say, what if Ray had never come to Boston?
Right.
What if those three things had never happened? How much would have been lost?
And he is the most unlikely person to do it.
But very few people even know. I don't think he has a wiki page still.
Wow.
And my question that I still struggle with is why New England is so reticent to talk about themselves to, I don't know if it's bragging, but it's just the discussion about it tends to be very buttoned down, and people don't really go back and relive these things.
And he was don't you think he was so unlikely as a person to, he was a lawyer from Kansas City. It doesn't make any sense that he was the one doing it. That's the whole thing in the movie. You're just, each time he gets to a new part, like the Boston Phoenix, that was an incredible newspaper that we all read. And,
well, he's an interesting guy. He would make a great Harvard Business School case study, because his interest, and he was brilliant, was as an entrepreneur, was creating things.
I see.
He had zero interest in running, zero interest in growing them or creating like a revenue stream for himself in the future. And had in his management toolkit one thing that he knew how to do, and that was to fire people. He didn't know how to manage people. Everybody at BCN at some point was fired and then hired back the next.
Wow, it's like Seinfeld or something.
But when I talked to Ray, and you know, I hadn't talked to him in 30, 40 years, but when I interviewed him for the film, and I said, you know, because there was a lot of stuff going on at BCN towards the end of his tenure there, I said, you know, were you concerned about it? He said, no, I was on to the Phoenix. I wasn't even thinking about BCN. And I realized when he was running BCN, he's still in the Tea Party, but he wasn't concerned about it. And so he really just moved through these. Now, he left other people to get wealthy off him. Don Law, who was the manager at the Tea Party, you know, went on to become famous. And the Mitch Hastings, who owned BCN, went on by the end of the 70s. He sold the station for 40, 50, $60 million, I think, to CBS or to Mike Weiner, this guy Mike Weiner, that created Infinity Broadcasting. And the Phoenix became a big successful. And Ray left town in 73, 74 with not a lot of money. I mean, he may have had a large check, but compared to the value of what he built, but that wasn't his interest as much as just, I think he just enjoyed creating these things, you know, dreaming them up and creating them.
Did a great job. You know, it's one of the things in the book that you have is a little scrap of newspaper that lists like 15 famous musicians that played in one weekend.
Can you read it? Just like who's on it? You have it there?
I'm not sure I can find it.
This is like
the beginning, or?
There's like 1 or 2 weeks in Boston. It's like Rod Stewart, Janis Joplin, who's on there? The Who, Junior Walker and the All Stars. I mean, you name them. And
it was incredible. Like just a little scrap, and you think, wow, I also missed that happening.
And they were all like, they weren't even big clubs. Like some of them were up with the Lenny's on the Turnpike.
Right. But it's really fun. It's like a book of all these, you know, just amazing little detail that you would never know or never know that existed. And it's scraps like that you wouldn't have. It's amazing.
We have the Led Zeppelin contract with the Boston Tea Party. I think it's 3 nights, 2 shows a night for the band.
$2,000.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Don Law is in it. Yeah. And someone mentioned Paul's Mall in the basement.
Yeah.
I see parallels to the folk revival. Many of the same players overlapped in the mid to late 60s, Club 47, Newport, Boston, Cambridge. It's true. Like they were all here doing the folk music.
But there's one thing that there was not enough of.
The Rat, yeah.
Was the feeder stream into this of the folk movement, which was really enormous and important. And it sort of dovetailed into this. But because I chose to follow Ray Reapin's course, he wasn't that involved. There's not as much about what was an incredibly important folk, movement in Boston during the early days.
But that wasn't part of WBCN, I assume, at that time.
No, in the beginning they played a lot of. Al Perry, who was the general manager, passed away recently, said to me, people forget that Spider John Kerner was as important to the early days of BCN as Aerosmith was later. That they were playing all of these. Musicians. Joan Baez was a sophomore at Harvard. Boston University. Yeah. Playing at Club 47. But yeah, no, it's a huge folk scene.
We should probably stop in a minute, but we'll tell the story about Aerosmith that nobody else wasn't in the movie. Like how nobody wanted to listen to them. It was one of the female DJs.
Oh yeah. Yeah, Maxanne. Yeah. So there were no women on BCN because, they weren't. It was just the way things were in radio. And Charles Laquadera did a public service announcement for Project Place, which is still around. It's a drug rehab program, and went on the air and said, if you're a therapist and you want to volunteer, they need your help. And if you're a chick and you can type, they need your help too. So a member who was the earliest stage of Bread and Roses was in her car, loved the station, loved Charles, and said she almost drove off the road. And she called her friends up and said, we got to do something about this. So they got a box of like 40 baby chicks, like live baby chicks. And they stormed the station without notice and dumped them on the general manager's desk and said, those are chicks, we're women. And they made two demands. One was that they wanted an hour of airtime, which they got to do really what was probably the first broadcasted women's hour on, domestic violence, on birth control and all of it. And they wanted women on the air, and BCN, to its credit, hired pretty quickly 3 women. One of them was Maxanne, who came from Seattle, who had the most extraordinary musical sense. She could pick out a winner, at 500 yards. And she started playing bands, and people were like, what is it? And she was proven right almost immediately. One of them was this group Aerosmith that everybody thought were kind of Yardbirds or Rolling Stones wannabes, and Steven Tyler sort of doing a Mick Jagger imitation. But she could hear the quality of their music, writing and their musicianship and the songs. And she kept playing it over and over. Dream on, dream on, dream on. And she broke Aerosmith. Another group she broke 2 years ago when the Cars were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame on TV. I'm gonna fall on my chair. On TV, Elliot Eastman from the Cars says the person we really need to thank is Maxanne, because before we had an album, she took our tape and started playing it on the radio over and over again, so much that it began showing up in these reports.
Charts, yeah.
Of what stations are playing what songs. He said, and all these music company guys in New York are going, what is this Cars tape? And they're all driving up to Boston to see what, flying up to Boston to see what this Cars tape thing is. And that's how they were, discovered. But I actually just talked to her tonight. She's doing well. But just, extraordinary sense of, she would hear a song, well, that's going to be a huge hit.
It's exciting that she could do that. So
I think.
Yeah. So I guess we need to stop because we're going to said we would do an hour, but thank you so much. This is incredible. The documentary everyone can watch this week, and the book is great. And I think it'd be a great present, honestly. I was thinking of a lot of people that would just enjoy it. They wouldn't even know they would enjoy it, but that's what's, they would think, oh, I don't know, I didn't hear the station. But the Boston history to me is what's really, the music history, the, political history, the city of Boston and, and Cambridge and Harvard and all these, so much in there that I did not know.
Should we tell people about the book plates that end up happening?
Oh, yeah, will you explain that? Or Lauren can come back and explain.
So I guess the accommodation to not having book signings generally is to sign like a plate that you can then put in the book with the signature. And so I'm going to sign a bunch of them for anybody who wants one. If you get the book and you want a copy of, author signature to go in the book, I guess they can contact the library. Is that?
Lauren, maybe.
Lauren
I'm not
yes.
sure where. Yeah.
So, Bill, once you send them to the library, what we can do is we'll have them available for people to. They'll be there. I'll send out an email and then ask people to respond to the email if they're interested in reserving one. Great,
and I'll sign as many as we need. Happy to do that. Also, if you go to our site, the film site, theamericanrevolution.fm, we have a newsletter that you can sign up for and, stay on top of what's going on with the film going forward. So, but thank you so much for doing this. I just really appreciate it. It's great to be able to talk
had to when
about
I
it.
saw the documentary, and I was like, this is so great. I couldn't believe it. I really felt like it was blowing my mind when I watched it. To not known anything about, of course I heard of a lot of these things, these pieces, but to see it in one, story was really interesting and exciting. And it really changed my whole impression of what was going on when I was.
I'll have to tell my team pressure media can use that as a blurb. Will blow your mind.
I know. So I just kept watching it. I loved watching it again. And someone said they've already seen it a few times. They taped it. So
that's the other thing. People watching it and I get it because there's a lot of little things in there. But
well, the second time I stood there with my remote pausing it because they were just, the first time you just hear the story, the second time it's like, wait, what does that say? What does that letter say? Who is that? I noticed people I knew in there and people's parents that I knew. So back in, it was very interesting. So thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you all very much. Yeah.
And thank you, Bill, for being here. And if you need to scroll up, there's some information. Bill, you should check it because I think people write a little bit to you. And if people want to check some of the links, they're in there, where to stream. And,
Yeah, I'll go through everything afterwards in
Yeah.
case anybody sent a note. Well, thank you.
thanks, everyone.